Every time I meet new people, I studied abroad my first semester, but every time I meet new people who were sophomore, a dear friend of mine, Paul, always introduces me as the grandson of Nelson Mandela. Of course, I like to believe that we do look alike, because this picture is the picture of Nelson Mandela. So I do not stop him. I play along and say, Google his picture and see who Nelson Mandela is. And the response goes from disbelief to awe, and they go like, really? What are you doing here? And I mean, at that point, I correct them and say, no, I am not Nelson Mandela's grandson. But of course, we all like to associate with greatness. But then how do we go on to build greatness? How do we go on to make leaders that will impact the world in a positive way? Now, what I'm going to talk about is 3 examples of how social innovation comes about through our differences and diversity within institutions. But first of all, I want to give you a perspective of how big Africa is and how diverse it is, because I feel like a lot of times we don't necessarily understand the vastness of Africa, because I hated geography, but I took some geography. But on the maps, Africa always looks smaller than America or the European continent. But really, this is how Africa looks like. If you look there, we can fit in China if you chop it up a bit. Then you can fit the United States by West Africa. Then you can fit France, and then you chop it up a bit, and then it still fits some space. Then if you want, you can also fit the UK in one of our islands. So really, if you think about it, Africa is really vast. And I went to an institution for high school for 2 years, which was called the African Leadership Academy. So it was trying to get all these people from all these diverse backgrounds to come together and to share ideas. The mission was to create the next generation of African leaders. So I am going to be an African leader. Thank you. Within the institution, about 34 countries were represented, and my biology class was about 7 students, and each of us were from different institutions. And when we discussed projects in relation to our countries and how we can apply the simple biological concepts to solve the problems in our various communities. Now, I'll give you 3 examples. The first example is Wiz Toys. My friend who's Julia, me, Madit, and Kevin, we're all from different countries: South Sudan, Kenya, South Africa, and Ghana. And we're all passionate about tutoring maths and tutoring physics. That was when I still liked physics. Now I don't so much. And we like to tutor physics. And we realized that students couldn't understand the basic concepts of force and all of that. And this was in a neighboring informal settlement, so the school was not necessarily as equipped as other schools. And what we thought about was that the community was full of Coca-Cola bottles out around, and we thought of an idea to create what we called Wiz Toys. And the basic idea was just to collect these water bottles and then create water rockets. And in that way, it would be fun for the students to see the water bottles shoot up, and then we could easily explain the concepts to them, and would also be recycling the water bottles that are around the community. And that was one idea that came about from this institution. The second idea was biomimicry. So I usually talk to my friends, and when I spoke to him, he was from South Sudan. He told me that there was malaria, and as someone who was from South Africa, I knew that malaria was a big disease in Africa and negatively affected, but I'd never necessarily met anyone who had actually contracted malaria or who had been affected on a personal basis by the disease. Now, if you look up the stats, to say the CDC in 2010 said there was about 266,000 deaths because of malaria, 91% being in Africa. But that doesn't necessarily mean anything if you don't necessarily have a personal contact. And after I had the personal contact, I had the motivation to now go and research on how little I can contribute into combating this disease that negatively affected my friend. And that was the motivation. And because he was from a different region, I was more fascinated to learn their culture and how they could combat the disease. And I did some research, and I found that there was no vaccination, and I obviously couldn't develop a drug because I was obviously still in high school. So one research paper that I came across talked about sound and how sound can startle mosquitoes. So I decided to go on to that idea and explore the idea of biomimicry. And then I wrote a paper that basically said that you could if you could take the sound of the predators of mosquitoes and you put it into cell phones, which a lot of Africans have we actually have the most cell phones in the world. It's just that they're not smartphones, but you could still put them into the cell phones and you'd be able to settle mosquitoes. And that would be a simple way, a simple way of combating the disease, because every time your cell phone rings, it would emit a sound that will settle the mosquito. And I thought that was an amazing idea that came about from the interactions, since I went to a school that was diverse and my biology class included people who had real life experiences with these diseases. Now, the third story is Pan-Africa. Now, Pan-Africa is a book series that was started by a friend of mine called Priscilla. And she's passionate about writing, and she read a lot of books as a child. However, the books that she read talked about bagels and talked about things that were not she couldn't necessarily relate to. And so she wondered, why is it that as Africans and South Africans, or students who were in that particular institution, we couldn't read things that we could relate to or things that we were exposed to on a daily basis? And she decided to start a book project and started a book series called Ekari. And Ekari is a story that will just basically take a tour around Africa and explore the different cultures within the different nations. And this, I felt, was another idea which was very innovative and had a social impact and could improve the perception that kids have as they grow up, and they could think of Mount Kilimanjaro as opposed to Mount Everest as the mountain that they have in Africa, and they could relate to the jollof rice that's found in Nigeria as opposed to Western Asian or Asian food that they find on the Western children's books. And all these ideas were built upon in an institution that really fostered different discussions between people from different countries. So a typical day that really brought about these ideas would include talking with the chemistry teacher. They're basically posing, but it's usually in the line like that, where you talk to your chemistry teacher and you talk about how you can apply a simple chemical concept to solve an issue in your community. Or when you're having lunch on a Friday, we had different family groups where you would discuss how your days had been, the normal daily living. And then in your family group, you would find that it's people from 7 different countries that you never knew of. My family consisted of someone from South Sudan, someone from Ethiopia, someone from Somaliland, and that really got to me because I couldn't necessarily relate to the cultures that they had. But then after the conversations and the personal interactions, I could relate with what the struggles that they were going through, the joys that were within the country, the tasty food that they had, and that spurred the interest to develop ideas where I could to help to solve some of the problems. And this went all in the whole institution. So what I want you to learn from my presentation today, or from my experience for 2 years on being an institution which had 34 countries represented, is that when you're in an institution that has such diversity, and you talk to the people, you get to feel that we are actually different, but we're also the same, and we care about the same things, and we can develop ideas that can make change. So I want you to take advantage of the diversity that is within Bates and go out there and become social agents of positive change. So thank you.